I've been a park ranger in this park for nearly a decade. You might think being a ranger is all about enjoying Mother Nature's glory, and mostly you'd be right. But sometimes it's an entirely different story. This particular park isn't just any patch of land. It's a vast expanse of wild wilderness, remote and isolated. But to me, that's part of its charm. There was a fellow ranger, Hank, an older, rough around the edges but wise man. He'd been working these parts long before I arrived. Hank would often recount odd happenings, strange sightings, and the folklore of the park. I'd laugh it off, suggesting he'd spent too much time alone in the woods. Yet a part of me took his tales seriously. Call it intuition or a gut feeling, but I believed there was truth in his stories. This place is magnificent. But when you are miles from the nearest town, you can't help but feel vulnerable. Vulnerable to the unknown. When you're here, you learn to respect this place, not just for its beauty, but for its secrets. And as I was about to discover, some secrets are better left untouched. Little did I know, a lesson awaited me that would forever change my perception of this remote corner of the world. I was on a routine patrol, the quiet isolation of the trail my only company. I took a break in a spot I enjoyed for its tranquil beauty. That's when I first noticed a peculiar stillness. No birds singing, no leaves rustling, not even the soft babble of the creek. I had never experienced such an unsettling silence in all my years as a ranger. In this unnatural quiet, I spotted something odd near the tree line, a strange silhouette against the vibrant hues of fall. As I squinted to see better, I choked on my breath. I was looking at a figure, tall and stark white against the backdrop. Thin, almost skeletal, its limbs elongated, bending in ways unnatural to humans. It stood on all fours, its back arched. Its pallid skin was tightly stretched over its frame, with two large, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the wilderness. There was no discernible mouth, just those intense, unwavering eyes. Frozen, I watched as it slowly rose, its form silhouetted against the sinking sun, an eerie violation of natural order. Then it spoke in my voice, echoing through the wilderness, asking for help, pleading. It was my voice, but altered, like a warped recording. That's when I realized I was dealing with something very out of place. I ran, leaving the creature behind, my heartbeat drowning out all else. Some secrets are meant to remain hidden. Over the following weeks, sleep evaded me as the memory tormented me. Closing my eyes, I'd see that pale creature again, with my own voice haunting me. Unable to articulate my experience without sounding insane, I kept it all to myself. But it was all bottled up. One day, I discovered old records of similar sightings in the ranger station. Creatures that mimicked human forms and voices, dating back generations. They were known as shadow walkers, and the name itself was terrifying. Part of this land's history, they were believed to be ancient spirits, possibly predating the mountains themselves. They were shapeshifters, never perfectly mimicking sounds or forms, but getting very darn close. They were viewed as omens, and they were both feared and respected by the locals. Finally, I realized I wasn't going mad, albeit a horrifying revelation to learn what exists in the woods. From that day on, my duties as a ranger took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about protecting people from the wilderness or wild animals. It was about shielding them from something more hideous. My respect for the land deepened, and a vigilant eye was always kept on the unknown. I began to research more, delving into tribal histories and ancient folklore, consulting with local elders and historians. The more I learned, the more I understood the depth and complexity of these beings. They weren't merely creatures, they were manifestations of the land itself. My encounters with the shadow walkers became more frequent, almost as if they were testing me, recognizing my awareness of their presence. There were times I could hear them at night, mimicking the voices of my loved ones, attempting to lure me into the dark embrace of the wilderness. But I learned to recognize their imperfect mimicry. I followed the wisdom and warnings of the locals, and I never answered a call from the wild at night, always treating these encounters with a mixture of fear and reverence. I realized that being a park ranger was no longer just a job. It had become my calling. It was about being a guardian, not just of nature's beauty, but of its secrets and mysteries as well. My conversations with Hank took on a new meaning. What I once considered the old ranger's ramblings became wisdom, teachings that I now sought with a hunger for understanding. The years wore on, and the fear that initially gripped me evolved into a respectful fascination. The Shadow Walkers and I developed an unspoken understanding, a fragile truce based on mutual acknowledgement and respect. And as I walked the trails, patrolled the boundaries, and gazed at the untouched beauty surrounding me, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be, fulfilling a role that transcended just being a job. And in a place that was much more than a park, it was a realm where the natural and supernatural coexisted, a wilderness alive with history, myth, and magic. I have something absolutely terrifying to share. This happened 3 months ago behind my house in Kittening, PA. I had a few friends over on a Saturday evening and we were all hanging out in my backyard having a cornhole tournament. I recently got really into cornhole and so did a few of my friends, so we play now every chance we get. I've spent so much money on different kinds of bags you wouldn't believe. Anyways, it was about 8 in the evening, and we had been playing for a few hours and having some drinks when we started hearing this really weird noise come from the back of my property. We were playing under the lights because I have a big old spotlight in my backyard so we can play late at night. Now I'm a hunter, and so are a lot of my friends, and we all hear this noise, and no one recognizes what it could be. I don't even know if I could describe it, but imagine a bullfrog mixed with a gorilla. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the best I can describe it. I know it doesn't make any sense, and we felt the same way, but we kept hearing it, so my one buddy John thought it was a good idea to go in the woods and see if we can find what is making this sound. There were 4 of us who decided to go looking, and I grabbed a spotlight and we set off into the woods. Now, when we were playing cornhole, it sounded like this thing was maybe 40 to 50 yards away as best as I could tell. We are in the woods about where I thought it was coming from, and now the sound is even further away. So we go in further and the sound is moving like it's either trying to get away or trying to bait us in for a trap. Well, it was certainly the latter, because what happens next is why we don't play cornhole at my house anymore. My friend John shouts out to the group, "Hey, look right there!" We see this thing because I don't know what to call it. This yellowish, hairless creature standing behind the trees with these claws wrapped around the front of the tree like it was hugging it. As soon as John said that, this thing jumps out from behind the tree and starts making these crazy sounds coming from the back of its throat. It had this rectangular head and very deep-set eyes that were glowing red. Its mouth looked like it had 3 or 4 rows of teeth. It looked like it could bite through an arm or a leg if it got a hold of it. Its veins were also bulging out all over its body. Gosh, just talking about it kind of makes me sick. It was pretty tall, maybe a foot taller than most of us, but it was kind of thin but muscular. My friend Will, who is always carrying, pulled out his 9mm and shot at it 3 times, but missed. It moved as soon as he reached for his weapon. It moved so fast, like it could sense what was going to happen before it occurred. That was the last we saw it. It just took off after Will shot at it. Honestly, I'm at a loss on what to do. I didn't report anything to the police because I don't know what to say. We go to John's house now for cornhole, and we all carry all of the time. I was renting my house, but I've since found another place. I don't want to live where this thing was in my backyard. What on God's green earth could this have been? My friends think it escaped from some facility near my old place. There was this warehouse there that no one really knew what went on there. It's all fenced in too, out in the middle of nowhere, really. We didn't even know it existed until someone showed it to me on Google Maps. I don't know if they are running some crazy genetic experiments back there, or this thing came from another dimension or underground, but one thing is for sure, I don't want to run into it again. Unidentified aerial phenomena aren't exactly a new thing. I mean, they used to be called UFOs, and before that they were something else. We've basically been trying to find a name for them since we as humans could talk. None of the acronyms really do them justice, do they? Maybe that's because each title brings on a very specific image. UAPs remind us of obscure lights like the orbs over Arizona in 1997. UFOs remind us of the classic green men in a flying saucer, but that doesn't cover every variable. Those two sides of the Venn diagram don't encompass everything that we've seen. The sky is home to almost as many phenomena as the sea, and almost as many creatures. That's the UAP that I encountered. That's the one we were asked to identify, to follow, and to eliminate. Saying it made us nervous would be an understatement. One of the planes was being tailed by an unidentified aircraft. It started over the skies of Nevada and followed the plane east. It registered on radar, and the pilot caught glimpses of something massive diving above and below the clouds. The pilot described it as too mobile to be any type of human craft. He couldn't make out the details through the density of the atmosphere, but he could tell that its movements were too agile to be man-made. There are protocols for that type of encounter. Believe it or not, they happen quite frequently. Most times, the danger posed by the mysterious craft quickly dissipates. We weren't that lucky this time. Then again, we weren't exactly dealing with an aircraft. Suddenly, the unidentified object increased its pace. It cut ahead of the plane and jumped below the clouds. For a split second, it was visible in its entirety to the pilot and to the recording instruments within the cockpit. The findings were unanimous. It wasn't an aircraft. It was alive. It was a creature of some kind, as large as a 747, structurally similar to an eagle, except in the places where its feathers were missing and its leathery flesh was visible beneath. The turbulence caused by its erratic flight pattern was strong enough to throw the plane off course. They landed safely. That's when I was contacted. Myself and a group of pilots were sent up in F-16S to attempt a pursuit of the creature. We scoured the area, searched as thoroughly as we could, but returned to base empty-handed. All we had were the original readings and the pilot's description of what he saw. That was enough to keep us interested, especially as other reports trickled in from civilians. Fortunately, the creature was always too far away to be vividly captured on film. We used those reports to track its flight path. We spent months trying to predict its behaviors, so that when it turned up, we'd be waiting. Whether or not the creature had any cruel intentions at heart is obviously up for debate, but its existence was enough of a threat to our security that something had to be done. At the time, I wasn't the type to ask a lot of questions. I liked having orders. Orders made things easy. Of course, we didn't expect that the beast would come for us. We woke up to alarms. Training and adrenaline filled in the gaps where fear would have left us vulnerable. The base was fully alert and capable of violently defending itself within minutes. We were expecting an airstrike. We were watching the gray skies overhead, waiting for the clouds to explode. Our anti-aircraft operators were screaming with chatter, unsure of whether or not to act on what they were seeing. It took the rest of us a moment to catch on. We didn't know what it was until it was on top of us. Even the few there who had actively been pursuing the creature didn't expect to see it like this. It descended through the clouds and blacked out the sky behind it. It seemed to spread its wings from horizon to horizon. It was easy to imagine the giant bird spreading its giant maw and plucking us all from the ground. The anti-aircraft missiles kept that from happening. Small explosions rippled against its body, sending shock waves through its feathers and through the musculature below. It let out a screech that shattered every pane of glass on the base. Then it pulled upright and flew away. We wanted to run it down. Our own vehicles were suddenly inoperable. We were stuck there with no choice but to watch it depart, knowing that our best defenses had only tickled the great creature. It had come down and warned us, we decided, and no one wanted to chase it anymore after that. We were scolded by our superiors. Of course we were. Blaming us was the only action they could take. We took our lashings and moved on. The incident at the base was described to the press as a routine drill. The papers ran whatever story they wanted to, most often suggesting that we had tested some top-secret weapon or vehicle. The sightings from around the base were easily explained away as weather phenomena. The creature was so big already that it was easy to imagine it was only a cloud, painted alive by just the right balance of wind and moonlight. Before we could resume the hunt, we were relieved to learn that the beast had been brought down by someone else. An international ally had spotted it over the ocean and sent the beast to the depths below. That was a better place for it than the dirt of the American Southwest. And now we have new protocols. There are new words in our lexicon and new orders that get issued when a UAP exhibits specific patterns. When it's alive, for instance, we don't pursue. We can't risk inviting something like the bird back to our military bases. So about 2 years ago, I had to move because I got a promotion and needed to switch cities. I moved from Chicago to San Francisco. I'm a single parent, so it was difficult already, but my kids had a hard time adjusting to the city. It was completely different. Money was tight, so I had to rent a small apartment, and the goal was to only be there for a few months, no longer than a year, until I could upgrade us to a better one. It wasn't much of a place, but it was good enough. There was a kitchen, a bathroom, and my kids shared a room while I slept on the couch. We were there for a few weeks when one of my kids began waking me up in the middle of the night because they were having nightmares. This was unusual, but I thought it was just stress. She would talk about a tall man who wouldn't let her sleep. Like I said, weird, but stress does things to kids. My oldest child was struggling to sleep too, but just said she didn't feel tired. I thought it was jet lag. A week or so later, I came home from work in the early afternoon. I get home before the kids do, so I try to make them their snacks. I was in the kitchen when I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. There was nothing there, but I thought maybe I heard the neighbors. I turned on the stove and suddenly it was like I was shoved. My sleeve caught on fire, but thankfully I wasn't hurt. When my kids came home that day, my youngest was pale and shaky and had a fever. She spent the whole night screaming and yelling about the tall man. Throughout the night, things just got weirder. Doors opened on their own. Plates were smashed on the ground. The apartment was icy cold and was filled with this awful stench like rotting meat. I decided to take my kid to the ER, and as we closed the door behind us, there was a lot of banging and rattling from inside the apartment. By the time we made it to the ER, my kid was fine, fell asleep in my arms. We made it back by early morning, and it was beyond trashed. Everything was broken. Pillows were torn to shreds, boxes emptied, dressers flipped over. It was awful. This was the start of the hell we would start to live in. Every night the house would be trashed. We just lived in constant filth. My youngest began to have behavioral issues that led to them being suspended for trying to attack another student. She became increasingly violent and had to be locked away at night, and my oldest had to sleep on the couch with me. I consulted behavioral experts and therapists for her, but nothing helped. As she grew more violent, so did the instances around the apartment. There were times I would wake up to a pillow pressed against my face, the burners on the stove turned on, or water running while the drains were clogged. After a year, I had enough, broke the lease, and moved us to a motel for a little while. Once again, my youngest became horribly ill and spent hours vomiting. She was sick for a few days, but once she was better, she was no longer violent. She was very calm and back to her normal self. But after a few weeks, it came back. Weird things happened around the motel. She became aggressive, and I began hearing and seeing things. I'm not crazy when I say this, but I would see a tall, dark figure out of the corner of my eyes. Sometimes it would just stand there, but other times it would seem to come at me. I began to have awful nightmares where I would see it. Often I would die and wake up sweating and shaky. My youngest began sleepwalking, and I'd often find her trying to leave or grabbing a knife or something. I began to do some research and seen that maybe we were being haunted by a ghost or a demon or some evil being, so I bought some crosses and put them up in the room. Every night they would fall to the ground no matter how they were put up. I'd rest it on a dresser and it would end up halfway across the room. Eventually I tried to contact a local church. Of course, whenever we got there, she was perfectly normal. They tried to ask her questions, splashed holy water, all kinds of stuff, but she didn't react in any way they wanted her to. We took them to the motel room, where they questioned her and seemed to try to provoke the evil in her once again, but nothing happened. They basically told me she was perfectly fine, but that they'd pray for her. They didn't think anything evil was haunting or attacking us. That night, everything was so much worse. Things were being thrown across the room, and my youngest attacked me while she was sleepwalking. She had this inhuman strength. It was like fighting a grown man. I called again and asked for help, but once again she acted normally. They didn't say anything, but it definitely felt like they thought I was lying. I've spent the past year moving around just to get a few weeks of sanity back. Fortunately, I was able to do my work remotely, but my kids are struggling in school. My youngest is always in trouble, and I'm afraid to even let her leave the house. It doesn't matter what I do. This thing always returns, and it won't go away. I can't keep doing this to my kids, and I want my child back. A few years ago, I was staying with a buddy in his huge farmhouse out in rural Texas. And when I say rural Texas, I really mean it. This place is out there. His place was massive and had a ton of land surrounding it. We were both writers, or should I say, aspiring writers, and it was the perfect place for both of us to lock ourselves away and get on with our novels. The views were amazing, which we hoped would be inspiring, and there were plenty of deer on the property just wandering around aimlessly. My buddy was pretty protective of them lately, mainly because a couple of times over the last week or so, we'd found one mauled at the edge of his land. Let me tell you, that's never pretty, and it upset him a lot. I mean, this guy loved doe, and it was just a large congregation of doe everywhere. He would constantly be setting out apples for them and salt licks. He was always sticking them around, hoping to draw them in. I think his plan was to pet one and probably befriend one. When it happened for the third time, despite it being what can happen often in nature, he decided to put down coyote traps as he assumed that was what was hurting his deer. Like I just explained, he became pretty obsessive and very possessive of his deer. Maybe it was a coincidence, but there wasn't another attack for a few weeks. So he was sure that the traps had driven away the coyotes. I mean, this was a good thing. But we had also seen a few fawns, and then he was beginning to get really anxious that they would be easy pickings if the coyotes returned. After all, fawns are pretty defenseless. He even took to sleeping downstairs with a shotgun next to the door so he could rush out and help if needed. I thought he was crazy, but then this story does get crazier because one night we both heard an unmistakable howl outside. Even as a writer, although we both pen crime drama, I would struggle to put into words exactly what it sounded like. So the term howl is the best that I can come up with. I think it is the single most terrifying noise I have ever experienced. I bolted down the stairs to find my buddy and the gun gone, the front door wide open. I threw on some boots since you never walk outside in Texas without boots and ran down to the traps. And that was when I saw it for the first time. Despite standing with a gun aimed right at it, my buddy was frozen. I mean, I can't say I blame him, for there in the trap was what I can only describe as a horrible wolf-like creature. Now I heard your audible gasp, your disbelief. Why on earth would I jump to that conclusion? Surely it was just a large coyote, or maybe a plain old wolf. Well, let me ask you this. Did you ever see a coyote stand on two legs just like a person and walk upright? No. Did you ever see one that had a long, skinny body and arms with hands resembling that of raccoons? Not paws and not human hands? I didn't think so. Have you ever seen one covered in hair so dark that it literally absorbed the light around it? And have you ever looked at something's face and thought, that looks like a wild dog, but with human eyes? I bet you haven't. Well, a thing with those descriptions was caught in the coyote trap. It was huge, taller than both me and my buddy, and we're both 6 feet, ballpark. This thing was mad, viscerally angry, veins popping, mouth frothing as it pulled violently against the trap. Shoot it, I whispered to my buddy, and he seemed to snap out of his trance. He raised his gun and fired off a shot. Normally he's a pretty good aim, but I think the fear overtook him so much, which led to unsteady hands and the shot went wide. What it did achieve, however, was to fire up this thing more. It gave another howl, although now being closer it almost sounded like a human scream, like the Incredible Hulk, and it ripped itself out of the trap. We were now the ones screaming, and the gun was going off as my buddy was just shooting wildly at this thing, like he was playing Doom. I don't know how he could have missed every shot, but we'll never know because this creature, wolf thing, ran off and never came towards us and seemed to be more pissed at being caught than wanting to hurt us or retaliate. The deer, of course, had all fled due to all the commotion, and I'd felt like it took quite some time for them to feel brave enough or safe enough to come back and graze. We both stayed up all night those next few days, guns in hand, ready to shoot at the first sight of it coming again. Well, it never did. My buddy installs all sorts of expensive security equipment, cameras, etc., but nothing like that thing has ever been seen or heard on the property again. We will never know exactly what it was and if it was hurt or if there was more, but I will never forget seeing a human-like body with a dog's head and human eyes. It's by far the worst thing I've ever experienced, and I hope to God that I never see anything like it ever again.